Today's scripture reading brings us to the book of Psalms. Now, just a couple disclaimers as we move forward this month, and that is as we get into the book of Psalms, you will find that our videos are going to be more devotional in nature and less instructive. As we've gone through Ezra and Nehemiah, those historical books, I felt it necessary to kind of give you a synopsis of an overview of what was going on, historically speaking, to kind of tell the story. But the book of Psalms is more poetic in nature. It doesn't necessarily follow, it has themes through the Psalms, but it doesn't necessarily follow the same type of nature. So we're not going to, I'll give you some instruction on it as far as headings for the Psalms, and for the larger ones, we may break them down. But these first five today, I have a title for each Psalm because they're short in nature, and that's the way I've got those listed. But they'll be more devotional in nature. And so what I want to do today as we look through the first five Psalms is give you kind of the heading that I have for each one, and then something to chew on from each one of them as well. And so we begin here in Psalm 1, and the title of this one I have is The Difference Between the Godly and the Ungodly, because as you look down through these 6 verses, it speaks about the blessed man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, standeth in the way of sinners, sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And it describes him, and in verse number 4, it says, the ungodly are not so. And so it's kind of comparing the two. And the contrast that we see is the godly are planted and they are watered, whereas the ungodly are dried up and blown away. So there's Psalm 1. Psalm 2, I titled it this way, and that is The Conquering King Jesus. Because Psalm 2 has a lot of prophetic application to it, speaking of his anointed and how I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion, verse number 6. But so I have that titled The Conquering King Jesus. And this psalm speaks about how the earthly kings, and they will conspire against God, yet they are nothing in comparison unto him. And then I want to give you verses 11 and 12. It says this: serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish away from the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are they that put their trust in him. And you'll see David throughout some of these Psalms multiple times, I think at least 3 times in the first 5 Psalms, speaking of putting their trust in the Lord and those that do and what they get for it. Psalm number 3, I have rest in the security of God, because David is, you see the contrast here in verse number 2 says this: many there be which say, my soul, there is no help for him in God, Selah. Verse number 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. It closes it out in verse number 8, salvation belongeth unto the Lord. And yes, it does. Listen, there is security, there is rest in God, and putting your trust in the Lord. Chapter 4, the 4th Psalm, we see that he prays and praises. We see in verse number 1, he's saying, hear me when I call. Verse number 8, the last one, first and last ones, he says, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. For thou, Lord, only makest me to dwell in safety. And so David is praying for the Lord's provision and the Lord's safety, and calls on them to put their trust in the Lord, verse number 5. And verse number 8, he gets to it and he says, I'm going to lay down in peace and sleep. He's not worried because he knows that God is on the throne. And then lastly here, Psalm number 5, David prays God's guidance and his retribution upon those that have rebelled against him. And it's interesting, he says in verse number 4, he says, thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. Verse number 10, he calls for him. He says, destroy thou them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions. For they have rebelled against thee. And so he prays both for God's guidance for him and retribution unto those that rebel against him. And we see in verse number 3 that David prays expectantly. He says, and I will look up. David is expecting something from God. So he prays expectantly. He worships fearfully. Verse number 7, but as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear will I worship toward the holy temple. And in verse number 8, he is seeking God's path. And I love the way this is worded. He says, lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. He says, make thy way straight before my face. He wasn't worried about his way. He was worried about God's way for him. So a lot of people will look maybe at David here in this the fifth Psalm, and then wonder, well, David's praying that God destroys him. You know, David had an anger against the wicked, just as God is angry with the wicked every day. I think, we should pray for them, but their ungodliness and rejecting of a holy and loving, merciful God, it should mean something to us. It should move us too. We should not excuse the wicked. It should make us angry as well. So there's the first 5 Psalms. I hope this has been a blessing and helped unto you. And Lord willing, we will see you tomorrow.